Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so this is our second video on Derrida, and really the first video I think where we really start to delve into Derrida's philosophy in some detail. And what better place to start with Derrida than this notion of difference. Difference spelt with an A, not an E. I think this really underlies all of Derrida's philosophy, so it's an important word to come to terms with. I've broken the video up into 4 parts, and today all we're going to be talking about is difference, so we'll flesh it out in quite a bit of detail. So with that said, the first part of the video is difference to aspects. So in the essay, which is titled Difference with an A, just difference actually. The with an A is not part of the title. Derrida he opens that essay talking about these 2 aspects that belong to the verb to differ. So the first aspect is just difference as distinction, inequality, or discernibility. And this is basically the traditional notion of difference. It's what we normally think about when we think of the word difference. And I've got a quote for you. The sense of not being identical, of being other, of being discernible, etc. It is necessary that interval, distance, spacing occur among the different elements and occur actively, dynamically, and with a certain perseverance in repetition. So here basically difference as not being identical. And another word that Derrida likes to use here is difference as otherness. There's an other quality to this aspect of difference. Another thing that he mentions there, which is important, is this notion of interval or space. And in particular, although it's not a hard and fast distinction, there is the idea here that space is important as opposed to time. So the emphasis in this aspect of the meaning of the word, of the verb to differ, is space. And another thing that he mentions there in that quote is that this interval should be active, dynamic. And you remember in the first video we talked about this being an important part of Derrida's thought as well. So there's that dynamism, and there's a perseverance and repetition. Repetition's another important word for Derrida. So there's again that sense that there's activity here. It's not locked in a fixed and complete and permanent difference, non-identity, distinction. The distinctions are not set in stone. There is always room for movement and change, even within these differences that we may be able to identify at some point. So that's the first aspect of differ. The second aspect is to defer. And this is something that we don't think of when we think of the word difference. Here's what Derrida has to say about it. The interposition of delay, the interval of a spacing and temporalizing that puts off until later what is presently denied, the possible that is presently impossible. To differ in this sense is to temporalize, to resort consciously or unconsciously to the temporal and temporalizing mediation of a detour that suspends the accomplishment or fulfillment of desire or will, or carries desire or will out in a way that annuls or tempers their effect. So, okay, difference here as delay. Like I say, something we don't normally associate with the word differ. But this is one of the reasons why Derrida needs this, or felt the need to coin a new word here, difference with an A, because he wants to include this aspect in his philosophy. He wants to lock it in at the ground level, at the same, along with difference as distinction. So there's this difference as delay. You'll notice the Derrida talks about temporalizing here. And so this is kind of the parallel, or the counterbalance to the first aspect, where space was more important. Here, time is more important. Although he mentions spacing in the quote, the spacing is really connected with temporality. It's a temporal space, if you like, a temporal interval. So we've got that kind of balance here between the two. So Derrida's putting into, or maybe he would say preserving, the notion, these two aspects, preserving these two aspects in the verb to differ, which we have forgotten about, one of which we've forgotten about. And you might say, like, to defer, well, that's not really difference, is it? But then it is, right? It's difference in time. It's difference through temporality rather than mere spatial difference. And that's, though, what we've focused on. That's what's become predominant in our philosophies, in our way of thinking. We think in terms of space. And so you can see in this word, differ, we've just adopted the spatial aspect, the aspect that emphasizes spatiality, and we've neglected or forgotten this aspect that involves temporality. And in fact, so much so that when Derrida points it out, deferring is a kind of difference, we think straight away we think, that's not right, is it? Does that make sense? It doesn't even make sense to us anymore, because we have completely ignored it for so long that it's been lost. So essentially Derrida is bringing this meaning back. It's a difference in time, essentially. And you'll notice some of I'm saying that a lot today, you will notice anyway, in that quote, he talks about a detour that suspends the accomplishment or fulfillment of desire or will. And this has a real sense of Freud coming through, psychology or psychoanalysis. And that is going to feature in a much bigger way later on in this series. So anyway, that's the first part of difference with an A, these two aspects. The second part of the video today is difference, presence, and sameness. So in this part, I really want to just focus on these two notions that are really quite central to this idea of difference with an A. So first up, difference in relation to presence. Let me start with a quote. Difference is what makes the movement of signification possible only if each element that is said to be present, appearing on the stage of presence, is related to something other than itself, but retains the mark of a past element and already lets itself be hollowed out by the mark of its relation to a future element. So, okay, each element is related to something other than itself. This is essentially that first aspect, right? Distinction, non-identity, otherness. And then he also says each element, though, retains the mark of a past element and is hollowed out by the mark of a future element. And there is time, right? Temporality is being brought into this notion, and that's our second aspect, the aspect of delay or deferment. So that's the first thing that I wanted to point out there. But to bring this back to the main point, presence, what Derrida is saying here is that presence is actually grounded in difference, or rather what is said to be present is grounded in difference. And this is going to, we'll talk about this idea later as well, because this is one of Derrida's fundamental, one of the main things he's resisting with his philosophy is what he calls the metaphysics of presence. The idea that presence and the present is the most important thing. And essentially, when we in our philosophy, we have raised the present and presence to this. We've given it a central position. Everything that we tend to think about, we think about in terms of the present, or from the starting point of the present. We move from here to discuss the past, maybe in the future, but the present is our grounding point. It's where we start. It's where our philosophy begins, which is natural, right? It makes sense because everything happens in the present. But Derrida's point is that the present is not actually fully present. The present isn't even fully present, because there's something underneath this presence that grounds it, that makes it what it is. And that's what Derrida's getting at with his idea, his notion of difference with an A. Each element retains the mark of a past element and is hollowed out by the mark of its relation to a future element. So it's not that the present is being thought of in relation to the past and the future. It's that the past and the future are creating this present. They're a core element of this present moment. So much so that they are what, I wouldn't maybe go so far as to say they're what defines it, but they are certainly what constitutes it. They are the grounding for the present. So much so that Derrida even says difference with an A is the relation to an impossible presence, or it's the irreparable loss of presence. And that, with those sentiments, Derrida is really moving the focus, the emphasis away from the present as our starting point, as where we begin thinking about the world or our lives or our philosophies, and shift it to this deeper level, which is actually grounding this, what we think is present, but is actually informed by the past and even the future. So really looking to overcome, like I said, what he calls the metaphysics of presence. And difference is the way that he's really cutting the legs out from underneath this idea of presence. Difference is what grounds presence. And you can see it also with consciousness, the emphasis that philosophy has traditionally placed on consciousness. And it's defined as something in the present, right? Presence too, even, is how Sartre, for example, talks about the for itself, presence too. And Derrida is saying that that's already too late. That's already a derivative of what's more foundational. And what's foundational is this difference, which includes the sense of otherness and also the sense of delay. And that's what makes this so perhaps disconcerting to a lot of people, because it kind of robs us of a firm, solid foundation, because we think that consciousness, presence, that's something solid we can begin from. But if what's underneath presence, what grounds presence, is actually difference, then the ground of the foundation, the ground that we're beginning from, is already malleable. It's already in flux because it's based in non-identity, right? This is not that. It's based in otherness. It's based in delay, deferment. So there is no solid ground here. The solid ground is changing. It's dynamic. It's defined by difference, both of those aspects of difference with an A. So anyway, that's the first part. Difference as it stands in relation to presence. It's the ground of presence, and it really robs us of that firm, solid footing that we thought we had. The second thing I want to talk about in this section is difference and sameness. So Derrida says that in the one case, to differ, by which Derrida means difference with an A, signifies non-identity. In the other case, it signifies the order of the same. So the former, non-identity, is what we usually think of when we think of difference, but there's also an element of sameness to difference, and that's what Derrida is pointing out here. In the first sense, I think we can see a sense of sameness coming through when we think about those first two aspects of difference that Derrida pointed to, and which we talked about in the first part of the video. Difference as distinction and difference as delay. So in the first, difference as distinction, there is that non-identity. That's the traditional way we think about difference. But in the second aspect, difference as delay, there is an element of sameness to this. In the first place, right, what Derrida was talking about was the delay of desire, satisfaction of a desire. So you've got your desire here unfulfilled, and it's fulfilled later on. But those two things, although they are different, they're not the same, they're not identical, there is an element of similarity there, right? They're not completely different things. Furthermore, they are encapsulated, enclosed within a single individual. So there is again this aspect of sameness surrounding the second aspect. So I think that's the first place where we see sameness coming out. But I think we also see it in another way. And I'll give you a quote, and this, hopefully, it's kind of a long one, but this should let us get to what I think is the second aspect of sameness here. The fact that philosophy lives in and from difference, that it thereby blinds itself to the same, which is not the identical. The same is precisely difference with an A, as the diverted and equivocal passage from one difference to another, from one term of the opposition to the other. We could thus take up all the coupled oppositions on which philosophy is constructed, and from which our language lives, not in order to see the opposition vanish, but to see the emergence of a necessity such that one of the terms appears as the difference of the other as differed within the systematic ordering of the same. For example, the intelligible as differing from the sensible, as sensible differed, the concept as differed differing intuition, life as differing differed matter, mind as differed differing life, culture as differed differing nature, and all the terms designating what is other than physis, techne, nomos, society, freedom, history, spirit, etc., as physis differed or physis differing, physis in difference. Okay, so a really long quote, kind of repetitive in the middle, but hopefully that there's a little bit to unpack there. So philosophy, Derrida says, lives in and from difference with an A, has missed, he says, the sense in which the same is a part of difference. And what is the sameness? The sameness which is nevertheless not the identical. Philosophy is built on, he says, these coupled oppositions, and essentially these form the framework within which philosophy operates, within which our thoughts, the way that we have come to understand anything we think about, society, reality, anything that we apply our philosophy to has this foundation, these coupled oppositions. And the same which is not the identical is the passage in one of these coupled oppositions from one term to the other. So moving, as Derrida talks about, from, the intelligible to the sensible. When we're thinking within this pairing, and this is again how our thought moves. It's how we construct our opinions and our beliefs and our understandings of anything and everything that we think about. Operates within these kinds of pairings, the intelligible and the sensible. So anytime we move along that continuum from one to the other, that passage is what Derrida is talking about when he says the same. And it's the same because together these differences with an E, for example, intelligible and sensible, these differences form a system or a totality. So they become, instead of two different points, they become, as I said before, two ends of a single continuum. And so you have then one thing which you're sliding up and down depending on what you're talking about, and in relation to whatever it might be. So you're sliding back and forth or up and down on this continuum, and the continuum is a systematic whole. It's a totality. It's one thing. It's the same. Even though it's not identical, there's no identity here. The intelligible and the sensible are not identical, but they form together a totality, which again has an element of sameness to it, which Derrida is saying we can't ignore. We must not ignore. So the intelligible as differing from the sensible, that's the non-identity. This is distinct from that. But there's also the sensible differed. And that's something like the privation of the sensible. So that's one way to think about this as well, is think about good and bad. This is a better distinction, I think. We can see these as two non-identical opposites, what Derrida calls here in that quote, differing, non-identity. But bad can also be seen as the privation or the absence of good. So it can be good differed, or that aspect of sameness coming through. So there's just good, but good, but varying levels of goodness until you get to the end where there's no trace of good, and we just call that bad. But one way to think about this is that it's all just good. It's just that there are varying levels or varying degrees of goodness. So sameness, and kind of sameness in the structure, sameness in the framework, rather than breaking it down into the or going too deep into the individual parts of this framework. So anyway, that I think is an important way that Derrida sees the sameness coming through in his notion of difference. There is, within these oppositions that form the basis of philosophy, there is a sameness prevalent in them, which has been ignored or lost. Another thing that we need to note from that quote is the way that difference transcends traditional opposites. So difference with an A, transcending traditional opposites. So the oppositions, he says, don't vanish. We're not left with just one big thing with no distinction anymore. Rather, what this shows us, what Derrida is pointing out to us here, is that these paired oppositions have their ground in difference with an A, non-identity and sameness. And this allows us to go beyond these secondary oppositions, these pairings. A classic one is mind and matter, right? It lets us go beyond these crude oppositions, which are actually, as I said, secondary, derivative. So we can see the deeper grounding, the deeper foundation, which is difference with an A. And we then see that these paired oppositions are actually comprised of differences with an E. And that is a derivative notion that is built on top of this more foundational difference with an A. Derrida also says in Writing in Difference that difference with an A is not the opposite of identity. Rather, it's that which brings about the difference and the identity in the first place. So the fact that we can talk about difference with an E and identity is only because they're grounded in this deeper thing, difference with an A. And this is also what Derrida means when he says he's not favouring one metaphysical opposition. I won't define that word just yet, but yeah, let's just leave it to the side for now. One metaphysical opposition in these pairings. For example, another good example is time and space. He's not favouring time over space. Rather, he's trying to go beyond all metaphysical oppositions. He's trying to go past these dualisms, these paired opposites, to get to the ground for them, that from which they arise in the first place. And obviously that is difference with an A. So the third section I want to look at, it's kind of an unwieldy title, but yeah, it would have been nice to break these up into separate sections, but the quote that I use encompasses 4 of the 5 things that we talk about here. Anyway, difference, origin, difference, play, erasure, and disguise. So the way I've conducted this, I guess it's the way I do most of these videos, is starting with a quote. But I've got a couple of different quotes that apply in a different area, but they contain some core features of difference. They really shed some light on what difference is. So I've taken them from those different domains, and I'm applying them here. The first one is a quote with regards to language, and it belongs in a section on language, but like I say, it highlights some important ideas as far as difference is concerned. The phonic element, the term, the plenitude that is called sensible, would not appear as such without the difference or opposition which gives them form. It is not the question of a constituted difference here, but rather before all determination of the content, of the pure movement which produces difference. It does not depend on any sensible plenitude, audible or visible, phonic or graphic. It is, on the contrary, its condition. Although it does not exist, although it is never a being present outside of all plenitude, its possibility is by rights anterior to all that one calls sign, signified, signifier, content, expression, etc., concept or operation, motor or sensory. Okay, so the first thing that this tells us about difference is that difference is the origin. It's the ultimate grounding. And he says in their quote, it's that which gives these things, the phonic element, the term, the sensible, it gives them form. But this form is not the form of structuralism, which we talked about in the last video. Form here is what makes anything the thing that it is in the first place. What makes anything a thing? To be a thing, there has to be some form, some shape to it. Without that, there is no thing in the first place. And this form, what makes something a thing in the first place, is precisely what difference with an A is. It is, the point here is that, so first up, this is the origin. This is what to make a thing the thing that it is. To make a thing is the origin, right? It's the ultimate starting point for any. It's the ultimate foundation for your thought. And what Derrida is saying is that difference with an A is that ultimate foundation. It is the origin for any element, any positive element, whether that be a word or a concept or whatever. Any element has its foundation, has its origin in difference with an A. And that was what I said before, that's what one of the things that makes Derrida's philosophy so unnerving to so many, is that it strips away that solid ground. Right? Instead of taking these positive things and starting with those, so we've got these words that actually mean something first, and then we put them together, and then we see differences between them in this context and other contexts and so on and so forth. Derrida is saying actually that there's a deeper difference that underlies that thingness of the thing, of the word or the element in the first place, and that what is at the core, the root, the origin of this positive thing, this positive word or concept, is actually this negative thing, this difference. The positivity of our concepts, let's just take that as an example, is actually grounded in it's probably not quite the right word, but in the negativity of difference. And that is, many people don't like that. It kind of leaves us a little bit adrift, right? That we don't have that solid footing that we like, that we want to have. When we discover that something as central to our understanding of anything is shown to be grounded in this absence, this negativity, this difference that has no fixed core, then we feel, at best, we feel a little disoriented. At worst, we feel like we want to resist that, like we want to deny it. And that's kind of how people react to Derrida, right? So that's the first thing that I want to point out from that quote: difference as this origin, as what makes a thing in the first place. So instead of there being that positivity, that plenitude that we like to start with, that we have these firm concepts, these words, these terms, that we know what they mean and we can start with those, Derrida is saying, no, you don't have those, because what those things, the origin of those things, is actually this deeper difference with an A. And without that difference, there are no things in the first place. So very much opposed to the way that we normally think. Okay, the second thing I want to pull out from that quote is the relation between difference with an A and difference with an E. So he talks about this. He says it's not a question of a constituted difference with an E here. And that means a constituted difference means difference between two pre-existing things. Two things that this is the determined content that has already been determined beforehand. And instead, difference with an A is what he calls the pure movement, which produces that difference with an E. So it's prior to, so it's not just the origin of the thing, it's the origin of difference with an E itself. Difference with an A grounds difference with an E. And in a way, it's kind of obvious, because without there being anything in the first place, there can't be differences with an E between them. So if the things themselves are grounded in difference with an A, then the differences with E's, the differences with an E between those things is also going to be grounded in difference with an A. And he calls it pure, a pure movement. And he uses that word because it's prior to existing things which could differ in the regular sense of the word. It's prior to that secondary level of difference. That's what he's getting at here. He's getting at this deeper level, difference with an A, and that's what makes it pure, as opposed to the secondary or derivative difference with an E. I've got another quote as well. With its A, difference more properly refers to what in classical language would be called the origin or production of differences, and the differences between differences, the play of differences. So that's just a small quote, but there are a few things to pull out of that. First up, difference is the origin or the production of differences with an E. We've already talked about that quite a bit. Prior to difference with an A, there are no things, therefore no differences with an E. Yeah, we've covered that. But this is the extra thing. So difference as the origin or production of differences with an E. But he also mentions here difference with an A as the difference between differences. And this means the difference across different orders. I think that's the word that Derrida uses here. So he's talking about something like, I think, writing and speaking, different domains, if you like, and the differences that exist within those different domains. That's kind of we've been talking about difference with an E, but then we've got differences across these domains, and those are this I guess they're not secondary because we've already said difference with an E is secondary. So I guess tertiary, right? They're extra derivatives, differences across these different orders. And I also think that this would apply to those metaphysical opposites that we talked about earlier: life and matter, culture and nature, and the intelligible, the sensible. Those are different orders as well, and we can see that differences within those orders. We can compare those and get differences cross-domain, if you like, inter-domain. This is all talking about the way that we think, right? So this is all a reference to how we think, how we construct our thoughts and our theories, and the way that we come to understand the world, society, whatever it might be. This is what Derrida is getting at here. And actually that's going to come out as being what metaphysics is largely about for Derrida. Another thing that is important in that last quote is play, this notion of play. And all of these differences with ease and the differences between differences that Derrida is talking about, he calls play. And he says in Writing in Difference, he talks about play, chance, the throw of the dice. And this is all against the seriousness of the search for a single meaning, a single truth. It's a recognition then that these things are always provisional and that they only hold within a closure, is what he calls it. So they only have relevance, they only have their meaning, truth, they have bounds, they have boundaries beyond which they may no longer apply. So all of our truths, all of our meanings, they're provisional, and they only hold within these closures. And this is, again, play, bringing this back to the idea of play, that there is no one single ultimate truth. There's always this element of dynamism and fluidity and change that is inherent in reality. And so when we construct our theories, when we form our understandings, that's based on this dynamic and free-flowing and changeable core, grounding. And so what we do, we misunderstand things when we try to impose rigidity and a fixed order or structure on top of that. And that's what Derrida wants to pull down and reveal, that there is this deeper level which is characterized by difference with an A, not plenitude, not positive things, not fixed certainties. So there's a real Nietzschean flavor to this, right? That, I mean, I guess it's just the word, but it just, Derrida does talk about Nietzsche as well, of course, but it's that the word seriousness, against that seriousness, he's all about this notion of play, and that is very Nietzschean, right? He said, this is another quick quote, one could call play the absence of the transcendental signified, making play boundless. That is to say, as the shaking up of ontotheology and the metaphysics of presence. So we've talked about the metaphysics of presence. Derrida wants to shake that up. He wants to disrupt it. Ontotheology is like anything that kind of takes being as this positive notion and treats it as a pseudo-religious kind of thing, or even an actual explicit religious notion, which again implies positivity first. It implies the original the origin is something positive, something certain, something fixed in what it is. There is no ultimate truth. Derrida is refusing presence, and that's what play is. Play is the absence of this something that is certain. Our signs, the words, the concepts that we use to represent other things, they don't represent anything fixed. They don't represent any ultimate truth with a capital T. And this is what play is for Derrida, the absence of such a thing, the absence of this fixed center of the circle, which we can refer to. There is no center to the circle. It's all circles everywhere, and the circles are changing. So play then is, as Derrida says, boundless. And that's a very, there's a lot of creativity that comes along with that idea too, right? There's never-ending creation going on, free-flowing creativity, dynamism, words that just keep popping up again and again. And he stresses, though, that play in this sense, and this is of grammatology, play in this sense is not play in the world. Rather, it's the game of the world that must be thought first, before attempting to understand all the forms of play in the world. So just distinguishing there between, like, again, a secondary level of play, if you like, play that happens in the world, and this deeper level of play, which is the world. It's the ground for that secondary notion of play. Very similar to the difference between difference with an E and difference with an A, right? Difference with an A is that grounding. Difference with an E is the differences that are the differences that we find within things that have already been, that have already appeared on that deeper grounding. Luckily, he doesn't give us a new word, he doesn't coin a new term for play with an E or something. Okay, so that was difference with an E and play. Now I want to go back to that original quote, and there's one more thing to pull out from that, and that's this notion of erasure, erasing, and erasing in particular the word is. So Derrida says in that quote that difference with an A therefore doesn't exist, because existing requires a form, right? Something, in order to exist, must be a thing. It must be something. So difference, as he's talking about it here, difference with an A, doesn't exist, nor is it a being present. We've talked about this already. It's not present, it's prior to presence. It's that which grounds presence. Nor is it a sign, a concept, or an operation. All of these things exist with a positivity. They have a metaphysical plenitude, which again, as we've seen, presupposes difference with an A. So Derrida expresses this, not in that quote itself, but in other places he expresses this by crossing out the word is. And what he's doing when he does this is showing that we still have to use the word to communicate. We have to use the word to get our intentions across. But as we use it, we have to recognize that it's not actually correct. It's not actually right. There is no thing at the origin of philosophy, language, meaning, etc. Rather, there is only difference with an A. And that difference with an A is not a thing. It doesn't exist. It is not. But it's at the same time, it's not right to say it isn't. It's not that it is difference. We can't say difference is, but we can't say difference is not either. So it has this kind of strange ontological status. And the way that Derrida captures that is to cross out certain words. In this case, we can cross out the word is to show that even though, in order to make myself understood, I have to use the word is, when I'm talking about difference, it isn't the kind of thing that has existence. It's not the kind of thing that is in that full sense of the word. So that's what he's doing when he's up to that, when he crosses out certain words. So keep that in mind. If you're reading Derrida, you'll see that come up in certain places. So the second quote that I want to pull out in this section is, again, from a different discussion, a different context. Derrida is talking about Freud. But again, it just clarifies some things for us here regarding difference. So here's the quote: recognizing difference at the origin and at the same time crossing out the concept of primariness, we will not then be surprised by the Tom-Deutung, which defines primariness as a theoretical fiction in a paragraph on the delaying of the secondary process. It is thus the delay which is the beginning. So, okay, first up, Tom-Deutung is Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams, and the secondary process that he's talking about there refers to logical, reality-driven cognition, essentially, as opposed to the primary process, which is that governed by the pleasure principle. I don't want to go into too much detail regarding that just yet, but basically it's the idea is what makes the ego is the capacity for delay, the delay of pleasure. And this delay is the beginning, because prior to that delay there is no ego. The ego arises through this act of delay. The delay is that which is the beginning. And there's a clear parallel to what we're talking about with difference. The second aspect of difference is delay. And this is a nice example, actually, because prior to that delay, there is no difference. There is no ego. And then with the delay, the ego comes about. So the delay is, it's not that the ego is delaying anything, because the ego doesn't exist yet. The ego is brought about through this process of delay. And that's exactly what Derrida is trying to point out when he says difference with an A, including that second aspect of delay, is the ground. Difference with an A is the origin of everything that we tend to think is what we're starting from. We tend to think of as our starting point. So that was the first thing. Difference, that's kind of another reinforcement of what I've been saying about difference as the origin. So I also want to talk about this notion of crossing out the concept of primariness. Derrida says Freud defines primariness as a theoretical fiction. So it's a theoretical fiction, not in the sense that there's no origin as such, but in the sense that there's no origin in the way that we normally think of the word. So as an origin, primariness, we think of something, or with primariness in particular, we think of something existing before something else. That's what primary means. But as we've seen, difference with an A, delay here, is not a thing. And so the word primary just doesn't fit. So when we use it, we're as Derrida says, Freud says it's a theoretical fiction, because what is the origin here is delay, is difference with an A. So it's a rejection of this, the typical way that we understand anything, the typical way that we think. We think in terms of positivity, things that actually existing. Concepts exist first, and then we see differences between them. Not for Derrida. The concepts arise out of a deeper sense of difference with an A, which includes that distinction, but also this aspect of delay. So the last thing I want to talk about in this section is difference and disguise. So when we're talking about origins, and I guess in particular maybe metaphysical origins or ontological origins, origins are always disguised. Derrida calls them original enigmas. And the reason is that if these origins weren't disguised, then whatever is appearing would no longer appear. And I think a good analogy for this is something like your eyes. In order for your eyes to do the job of seeing, they themselves can't be seen. Your glasses is perhaps a better analogy, actually. In order for them to work, you can't see your glasses. If you see your glasses, you're not seeing the world. They're not doing the job of letting the world appear for you. Another example would be words, maybe. If your focus is on the words, you're losing the meaning behind them. And sometimes you might have experienced that you seem to drop out of your focus or something, and instead of picking up on the meaning, all you're doing is hearing these individual words. You get fixated on the phonetics of or something. Then you're hearing the words, but you're not hearing the meaning. And that's what the words are for, that the words are to let that meaning come through, that to facilitate the appearance of the meaning. And if they come to dominate, if they aren't hidden, if they aren't disguised, then you don't see what you're supposed to see from listening to words. So origins are always disguised. They have to be disguised in order to let the thing appear, and in order to let the thing that they are the origin for appear. And since difference with an A is the origin, it is always disguised. So we have to look for it, he says. So that's why it took someone like Derrida. Deleuze did something similar as well, to bring this notion of difference, just difference in itself for Deleuze, difference with an A for Derrida. They're very similar, these two notions, right there. It's really just a cosmetic difference between the two, but they're talking about pretty much exactly the same thing. But that's a bit of a side note. So yeah, origins, a difference with an A is always disguised. The example that Derrida gives is speech being disguised in an organized field. So a cultural field from which I draw my words and my syntax. That's obscured, that's hidden when I'm using the language. There's another example is in history. Again, disguised in an organized field, this time a historical field, from which you read and to which you write. So that field is hidden as you go about commenting on whatever it is you're commenting on, talking about whatever it is you're talking about. those fields, those cultural fields, those historical fields are hidden because they just become a part of the background. You don't notice them. They are what you are drawing from in order to present your ideas. And so those are the very things that you don't see, you don't recognize as informing your speech or your ideas or whatever it might be. Okay, so let's have a look at the last section here. Why difference? So I think it's pretty clear why Derrida coined this new word, difference with an A. I've talked about it a few times, but there are a few specific things that I do want to say regarding this. So why not just differentiation or difference with an E? Why not just leave it at that? That's what Deleuze did, right? He kind of talks about difference in itself, but he doesn't coin a new word. So why does Derrida do it? Well, in the first place, difference suggests some organic unity, a primordial or homogeneous unity. It suggests that there's already something there in order to differ from something else which is already there. So it already presupposes basically a context or a world or something, but something's being presupposed, and that's exactly what Derrida wants to. It's that idea that Derrida wants to cut out, get beneath. In essence, it doesn't get to this fundamental, foundational level that Derrida wants to get to. The second reason is that it misses the meaning of defer, right? It misses that delay that Derrida, that second aspect that we talked about, that temporal dimension to differing. Third, difference with an A founds regular difference with an E. It's the ground of that regular difference. Remember, because difference with an A is what things are in the first place. It's what makes things things in the first place. And only after that can they then differ with an E. So difference with an A grounds regular difference with an E. So it's not, it warrants a clearer distinction. Having said that, a clearer distinction, my fourth reason for why I think Derrida coins this new term is that changing the E to an A, I think appeals to Derrida. I'm pretty sure he talks about this I know he talks about this in that Difference essay. He says that although it completely alters the meaning, talking about something completely different, difference with an A, difference with an E, his change doesn't alter the pronunciation of the word. So difference with an A is thus hidden in a way. And that's exactly like the real difference with an A. His change to the word difference with an E is like this surreptitious move, which is hidden, which is disguised. And that is, I think it emulates or reflects exactly what he's saying difference with an A actually does. It is this hidden, disguised origin. I'm struggling to think of a word to apply to it. It is this disguised origin, but it is, despite the fact that it's disguised and hidden, it is the origin. It's the source for everything. It's what makes things things. So it's the most important thing, but it's hidden. And kind of that we see that paralleled, I think, with the change from E to an A, which doesn't change the pronunciation, keeps it hidden, despite the fact that this is an actual momentous, revolutionary, we could even say, change. Okay, let's have a look at a summary. So all about difference today, difference with an A. First up, those two aspects are difference as distinction, so not identical, and the interval here was one of spacing, so space was the main focus. The second aspect was to defer, so delay being brought about here. The interval, instead of being a spatial one, is one of temporality. We also talked about difference then as a kind of ultimate origin. It's what makes anything a thing in the first place. And this is very contrary to the way that we normally think, right? What is first, what is the origin, is not something doing something. It's not being. Instead, there is this strange kind of non-being that isn't not existing, but neither is it existing. It's this difference. It's difference with an A, and that is what is bringing about everything. It's the source. It's the origin of all of our thought, of all of our attempts to understand anything and everything. So difference grounds presence. And we talked about the way that much of Derrida's philosophy is a rejection of this metaphysics of presence. Presence is not what's first. You don't have a thing present and then differences and comparisons and ideas flow from that. Rather, those what you think are the first things, the terms, the concepts, whatever they might be, they're secondary. There is this deeper level which grounds presence, and it is fundamentally difference. But difference also grounds difference with an E. And Derrida calls this a pure movement which produces difference. So difference with an A is just more originary than difference with an E. We also talked about sameness, and this is something that has been neglected. Difference is non-identity, but it's also sameness. And with this, in connection with this, we talked about the differing structure of Derrida's. One of the examples was the intelligible differing from the sensible, but this being the same as the sensible differed. So seeing those two opposites as part of a totality, as just different ends of the same continuum. And this, we recognized in this an attempt by Derrida to go beyond traditional metaphysical oppositions, always looking for that more foundational origin. And strangely enough, and this is what is disconcerting about Derrida, finding nothing there. There is no ultimate grounding to anything. The ground itself is groundless. Another concept that was important for us here was play. So this is differences between elements, but also differences between other differences. Differences between differences across domains, I called them, across orders. And this is also reflective of the way that Derrida is against the seriousness of a search for a meaning or a truth. There is no singular, fixed, permanent truth or meaning. There are always that a particular truth is true within a boundary. It has limits. If you step outside those limits, that truth no longer becomes, that perhaps becomes a falsehood, or becomes one truth among many, for example. So play being central, very Nietzschean notion. And difference with an A doesn't exist, so it's not a thing. It's not being. We'll talk about Derrida's relation with Heidegger in a couple of videos' time as well, and obviously to discuss the notion of being. We also looked at the crossing out of the word is, that notion of erasure. So we still use the word, but we have to use the word in order to communicate, in order to get our ideas across. But as we use it, we want to remind ourselves or remind our readers that this is not quite the right word to use. It's not actually something that is, something that exists. Despite the fact that I'm using the word, it doesn't quite apply properly to this, whatever it is, difference in this case, difference with an A. And finally, we talked about disguise. Difference is always disguised. So difference with an A is an origin, and origins are always disguised as they must be in order to let whatever it is they're the origin for stand out. Okay, so that's us for difference. Hopefully that has clarified something. It's kind of a tricky notion to get your head around. Very, very similar, basically the same to Deleuze's concept of difference. So if you've read any Deleuze, I think this won't be that difficult to pick up. There are some slight kind of superficial distinctions, I think, but essentially they're definitely talking about the same kind of thing. But that's difference anyway. Next week, hopefully, I want to get a video done each week, but sometimes it just doesn't happen. But the next video, at least, we'll talk about the trace. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you then.